The findings were disturbing. In short, detention, whether on Christmas Island, Nauru or centres on the Australian mainland, is dangerous and unsafe for children. 34% of the hundreds of children we visited had severe to moderate mental illness, compared with 2% for children in the Australian community. Their health and well-being and that of their parents was at risk from cramped conditions in tents and remodelled containers, inadequate health care, even sexual and other assaults. Our findings in the Forgotten Children report have since been confirmed by other reports, including the Senate inquiry last year and the earlier Moss report, but also by reviews under the United Nations monitoring mechanisms, leading to the conclusion by the United Nations rapporteur on torture that conditions on Nauru, the heat, poor access to water, inadequate education and medical care, amount to cruel treatment contrary to the Torture Convention. Today, Australia continues to detain about 80 children, including, we think, about 36 babies at the Wickham Point in Darwin. About 70 children remain in the Regional Processing Centre on Nauru, where they're held in isolation from their extended families, from friends and from legal advice, with no hope for permanent settlement as refugees. Since our Forgotten Children's report was tabled in Parliament, the Australian Human Rights Commission has continued its monitoring roles in Australia's detention centres. In November last year, we reported our findings in respect of the children held at Wickham Point. These children, as part of 267 others who remain vulnerable to removal to Nauru under the Migration Act, have been there on average for over 2 years. Accompanying the Commission team to Wickham Point were 2 consultant paediatricians with very considerable experience in the health and well-being of asylum seekers and refugee children. Professor Elizabeth Elliott and Dr. Hasantha Gunasekera join us today, and I'm very grateful for their assistance. And they'll be making some comments in a few moments. At the time of the Commission's visit to Wickham Point, there were 164 families with 76 children under 18 years. The Commission conducted interviews with 69 of these children and the parents of 15 children who'd been born in detention in Australia. Many of the families and the children interviewed had spent some time already in Nauru and were clearly traumatised at the prospect of return to the harsh conditions that they'd experienced. The medical team interviewed and assessed the children using internationally recognised tools appropriate for their ages. Professor Elliott and Dr. Gunasekera will describe their medical evidence, but in essence, it reinforces the Commission's long-standing concerns about the severe mental and physical health impacts on children of prolonged detention in conditions that are considered by the United Nations to be well below international standards. In light of these findings, both the Commission and the 2 consultant paediatricians recommended to the government that these children and their families should not be returned to Nauru and that they should be released into the community detention, where appropriate, on mainland Australia, or be granted a bridging visa. The Commission sent a copy of the paediatricians' report and our recommendations to the Department of Immigration and to the Minister on the 6th of November last year. On receiving what I can only describe as an inadequate response to our concerns several weeks later, I wrote again last week to the Minister to reiterate our concerns about his public statements about his intention to return the children and their families to Nauru pending the outcome of the High Court decision. Well, since then, and as you will be aware, the High Court, in a 6-1 decision, has confirmed that government officials have the legal right under the Constitution and the retrospective amendments to the Migration Act to remove children and their families to Nauru or to any other designated offshore processing centre. We respect the High Court's decision, particularly insofar as it makes clear the constitutional powers of Parliament under Australian law. The Court's decision does not, however, deal with international law, nor with the specific treaty obligations that have been negotiated, signed and ratified by Australia over many decades. The Commission remains concerned that transferring children and their families to Nauru will further compromise their health and well-being, placing Australia at serious risk of breaching its obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Australia has an obligation to the international community to ensure that in all actions concerning children, the best interests of each child is a primary consideration. Indeed, over 60 nations at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva last year, at which I was present, called on Australia to reconsider its current offshore processing policies and to comply with its treaty commitments to refugees, especially children. Sadly, there's a widening gulf between the constitutional powers of the Australian government and the country's international legal responsibilities. Our national laws, in effect, allow us to wash our hands of the welfare of refugee children once they leave Australia's shores. Our laws impose no standards on Nauru to meet educational and medical needs of refugees. Indeed, the government's chilling defence to claims that it's in breach of its duty of care is that it has no control over the treatment of refugees transferred to Nauru. Now, it seems, it rests with the international community to use its influence to ensure the safety of refugee children under the agreed principles of international law. Australia's policies of mandatory and prolonged detention and offshore processing are frequently defended by governments as necessary to stop the boats and to save lives. This is a profoundly misleading conflation of two issues. There's little evidence that detaining children for a prolonged period is an effective deterrent to people smugglers. Indeed, both former Ministers of Immigration, Scott Morrison and Chris Bowen, have confirmed this under oath to the Australian Human Rights Commission inquiry 18 months ago. In conclusion, I urge the Australian government to take the mature and humane decision to temper its technical legal powers with respect for human rights obligations under the treaties that Australians have accepted. I hope that the open-hearted Australian people can persuade both the Coalition and Labor parties to return to the ideals of our democracy by allowing the children and families to remain in Australia to rebuild their lives as healthy and fruitful citizens.